Get the card. Take it out.
Governor, I would like to ask you...
Now, I'm going to sense the out cue here. Ready, friends? The out cue is going to be that may be running. Wait for me to say clip it.
Rather than any individuals that may be running.
How about take it to him? Thank you.
This is America selecting a president in 1980.
I'm coming out to camera, too.
A multi-million-dollar production with an all-star cast. Brought to you by CBS, NBC, and ABC from the world's largest studio, the 3,000-mile studio, from sea to shining sea. It ain't what it used to be. Politics has moved from crowded halls and streets into a box full of miracles, from smoke-filled rooms to control rooms.
Cue Frank, close. Tighten your shot. Thank you. Hold. Hold.
It's a television show now.
Ready to take the round. Right, quiet now. Let's sense the out. And take it to it.
Take it right to the commercial.
From CBS News election headquarters in Manchester, New Hampshire, here is Walter Cronkite.
From the NBC News Election Center in New York, John Chancellor and David Brinkley.
Tonight, reporting from Des Moines, Frank Reynolds.
With dramatic upset victories tonight,
Kennedy had to win in New York to remain a serious candidate. He did.
most surprising was the size of Reagan's win. Senator Kennedy has propelled himself back into the race.
The first victory for Bush in a long time.
Howard Baker third with 13%.
And Jimmy Carter, the winner on the Democratic side.
And Congressman John Anderson with 10%.
Senator Dole, who came dead last.
Ronald Reagan scored an overwhelming victory. And that's the way it is.
But that's not the way it always was. I'm Richard Reeves, and I've covered this wonderful Democratic craziness for almost 20 years. Extraordinary years. Political parties became shadows of themselves. Primary elections became a Tuesday night habit. Candidates began to sound like anchormen, and anchormen began to sound like campaign managers. Television took over American politics. It was a revolution. I watched it. We all watched it. But we didn't always understand it. It happened so fast. It's hard to remember. We once elected presidents, good ones and bad ones, without Cronkite, without Chancellor, without Reynolds. That's the way it was for more than 100 years. State and local political leaders would meet in convention every 4 years to nominate candidates for President of the United States.
The millions of Americans who have borne disaster.
For all those years, people got their political information from parties and from leaders, from talking to each other, from newspapers and then from radio. A man named Philo T. Farnsworth helped change that. He patented a little device called television. The world was never going to be the same. We didn't know that then. The thing just looked like a complicated gadget. But it was going to change the way America picked its leaders.
Pennsylvania cast 72 votes for Wendell Willkie.
1940 was the year television and politics first came together. The new gadget was used experimentally at the Republican National Convention. Party leaders were picking their candidates there without help from things like primary elections. By 1952, television wasn't an experiment anymore. It was in 15 million homes. Dwight Eisenhower and Richard Nixon were nominated on television at the Republican National Convention that year. One of the correspondents there was William Leonard, now the president of CBS News.
The coverage of conventions coincided with the birth of television. It was the 1952 conventions, two crackerjack conventions, Adlai Stevenson on the one hand and the Ike Taft convention on the other hand, in Chicago in '52, when television first came into its own, when the country suddenly saw it, and we were there. We were there, and we were there for the whole thing, and you saw these people getting into elevators, and then the door opened when they got down, and the elevator door opened, the people came out. Nobody ever seen anything like that before. And you saw the sweat on their faces, and you saw them looking at each other's eyes, and you saw the delegates with their flags. That's old stuff now. But it wasn't then, and it was marvelous. Not only that, it was a contest in both cases. And that made the news divisions. It made television news as something special. And so when the next one came along, of course, we had to exercise, and we did, all three of us. And then the next one, 4 years later, and it became the mark of what television news did best.
We need a fair, we need a sane, and we need an effective program for dealing with the communists.
Richard Nixon was the first candidate to show what an ambitious politician could do on television. Republican leaders wanted to kick him off that 1952 ticket for taking political gifts. He beat them. He went over their heads. He went on television, pleading directly to the people, talking about his dog, Checkers.
And you know, the kids, like all kids, love the dog. And I just want to say this right now, that regardless of what they say about it, we're going to keep him.
By the late 1950s, television was a national medium. America was wired from coast to coast.
You are right for $20,000 today.
But it wasn't much of a news medium. It was an entertainment medium. Television didn't kid itself or anybody else. It was a free enterprise carnival drawing a crowd for advertisers. In 1959, quiz shows were the biggest things on television. Then one of the big winners, a college professor named Charles Van Doren, confessed that he had been given the answers in advance. The nation was outraged. Television's carnival almost stopped. There was serious talk of government taking over the whole business. Network presidents were hauled down to Washington and had to literally beg for their existence.
We, however, do not think that the government should take over program control of the television industry.
Television needed respectability. It needed political power. News solved both problems. The fun and games machine began producing public service.
Good evening. The television and radio stations of the United States and their affiliated stations are proud to provide...
In 1960, television began to become part of the political process, but it was still a secondary news medium. When President Kennedy was asked what he considered the most influential medium in the country, he said, Time magazine.
Good evening from our CBS newsroom in New York on this, the first broadcast of network television's first daily half-hour news program.
In 1963, television news expanded, and polls began to show that more Americans got their news from television than from newspapers. But it was a different kind of news. Somehow television drew us in. We were involved. We shared their happiness. We shared their grief. It was like a death in our own home. Then there were many deaths in our home.
And with George McGovern as President of the United States, we wouldn't have to have Gestapo tactics in the streets of Chicago.
1968. Television was there. We were there.
How hard it is to accept the truth.
Politics was never going to be the same. Technology was creating a new American reality. The director could switch from scene to scene, from rhetoric to riot and back, and that was the new reality. Television seemed to be everywhere, and it was peeling American politics like a rotten orange. There had been a fundamental change in American life. Television changed what we knew and when we knew it. National leaders used to control that flow of information. Now the technology of television had taken over some of the functions, some of the power of government, and government didn't like it.
Perhaps the place to start looking for a credibility gap is not in the offices of the government in Washington, but in the studios of the networks in New York.
It was a confrontation of titans, U.S. versus TV.